The envelope sat on my desk like it knew the weight it carried. Thick, creamy paper, embossed edges, my name printed in sharp black ink, Major General Sarah Mitchell. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons. 8 years. That's how long it had been since I'd heard from my family. No calls, no cards, not even a whisper when I earned my second star or when shrapnel nearly took my arm in Afghanistan. Just silence. And now this, a wedding invitation for my little sister Emily, signed with one word from my mother, Helen, behave. Can you imagine a single word like I was still the girl they'd called a disgrace for choosing the army over a white picket fence? But what they didn't know was that this letter would unravel a secret tied to my father's closest friend, a man who'd change everything. I was in my office at Fort Carson, Colorado, the mountains casting shadows through the window when I first held that envelope. It smelled faintly of my mother's perfume, the kind she wore to church to keep up appearances. My fingers traced the word behave, and for a moment I was 16 again, standing in our Ohio kitchen, hearing her say, "You'll regret choosing guns over a good marriage." I'd walked away from that life, from her expectations, from my sister's shadow. I'd built a career commanding brigades, saving lives, earning scars. But family. That was a battlefield I'd never won. Emily's wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a reminder of everything they'd tried to erase about me. And yet I couldn't look away from that invitation. Why now? Why me? Here's the thing about silence, it's louder than words. For 8 years, my mother and sister had perfected it. No birthday calls, no condolences when my father passed, just a void where family should have been. I'd learned to live with it, to let the hum of the bass and the rhythm of drills fill that space. But this invitation wasn't just about Emily marrying some guy from Virginia. It was about facing the people who'd once told me I'd shamed the Mitchell name. And there was something else, a photograph I found tucked in my father's old journal, one I hadn't opened in years. It showed him young and proud in his uniform, arm around a man I recognized instantly. Admiral James Carter, his best friend from the Vietnam days. My father's last letter mentioned Carter saying, "He'll watch over you when I'm gone." I didn't know then how true that would be. What do you do when the family you fought for turns their back on you? Do you walk away or do you show up, scars and all? I sat there staring at that invitation, the weight of 8 years pressing against my chest. I could have ignored it, stayed safe in my world of orders and honor. But something, maybe pride, maybe defiance, made me book the flight to Virginia. I wasn't going to celebrate, I was going to be seen. And what I found at that wedding wasn't just a room full of strangers laughing at my expense. It was a truth that had been buried since my father's death, a truth Admiral Carter would bring to light. Want to know what happened when I walked into that ballroom? Let's find out together. I grew up in a small Ohio town where the air smelled of freshly cut grass and expectations. My family's house, with its white shutters and manicured lawn, was the kind of place where neighbors waved and secrets stayed indoors. My mother, Helen, had a vision for me, a life of garden parties, a husband, maybe a couple of kids by 30. But I wasn't that girl. I wanted to be like my dad, a soldier who'd walked through fire in Vietnam and came back with stories he only shared in quiet moments. He'd sit me on his knee, pointing to his old uniform in the attic and say, "Sarah, you can be anything you set your heart to." I believed him. So at 18, I left for West Point, chasing a dream bigger than our cul-de-sac. What I didn't expect was that my choice would build a wall between me and the people I loved most. The Army became my home. I climbed from lieutenant to major general, commanding thousands, leading missions in places where the air tasted like dust and danger. Every promotion felt like a step closer to the woman I wanted to be, someone who stood tall like Dad. But back home, my family saw my uniform as a betrayal. "Why can't you be normal?" my sister Emily would ask, her voice sharp with resentment. "You're embarrassing us." My mother was worse. At my high school graduation, when I announced I'd been accepted to West Point, she didn't clap. She just said, "You'll regret choosing guns over a good life." I can still see her face, tight, disappointed, like I'd torn a page out of her perfect story. By the time I earned my first commendation, a Bronze Star for a rescue mission in Iraq, I sent them a photo. No one replied. Not a word. The silence was louder than any medal. I found a letter in my dad's things after he passed, tucked inside his journal next to a faded photo of him and Admiral James Carter, his best friend from the Vietnam days. They were laughing in that photo, arms around each other, their uniforms crisp with youth. The letter was short, written in Dad's steady hand. "Sarah's like me, Jim. She'll fight for what's right. Keep an eye on her." I didn't know then how much those words would mean. Admiral Carter had been a shadow in my life, someone Dad mentioned with a smile, a name tied to stories of courage. But my family, they didn't see courage in me. To them, I was the daughter who'd chosen a path they couldn't understand. When Dad died, I stood at his funeral in my dress blues, hoping for a glance, a nod, anything. Emily looked through me. Mom handed me a program and said, "Don't make a scene." I didn't. I just left carrying the weight of their rejection across 2 continents. That's the thing about choosing your own path, it can feel like you're walking alone. But here's what I learned: the people who love you don't get to define you. They can try with their words or their silence, but your truth is yours to carry. I held on to Dad's letter, to the idea that someone like Admiral Carter saw me even if my family didn't. I built a life in the Army, surrounded by people who became my family soldiers, who trusted me, who fought beside me. But when that wedding invitation arrived, it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a door back to a past I thought I'd closed. What happened when I stepped through it? Well, let's just say the silence was about to break. The ballroom in Virginia was a sea of soft lights and polished smiles, the kind of place where every detail screamed perfection: crystal chandeliers, white lilies on every table, and laughter that floated like champagne bubbles. I walked in wearing my dress blues, the weight of my ribbons pressing against my chest, but the usher led me to a table tucked behind a pillar right by the fire exit. Table 12, out of sight, as if my presence was an afterthought. My mother Helen had planned it that way, her signature precision in every choice. My sister Emily, radiant in her white gown, didn't even glance my way as she glided through the crowd. 8 years of silence, and here I was, a stranger, at my own sister's wedding. But the real sting wasn't the seating chart, it was what happened when the toasts began. As the band paused and glasses clinked, Emily took the microphone, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. To family, she said, her voice sweet but pointed, even the ones who guard doors for a living. The room erupted in laughter, a sound that hit me like a cold wind. She turned slightly, her eyes locking on mine for a split second. "Here's to my big sister Sarah, who's probably keeping us safe from the coat closet right now." More laughs, louder this time. My mother joined in from her table, her voice carrying that familiar edge of authority. "Oh, Sarah always made things harder than they needed to be." The words landed like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I sat there, hands folded, my face calm, while the room chuckled at the idea of a major general reduced to a punchline. Across the room, I caught a flicker of movement, a few older guests, men with the posture of retired soldiers, exchanging glances. One whispered something, his brow furrowed, but no one spoke up. I'd faced worse than mockery. In Afghanistan, I'd walked through fire to pull soldiers from danger. But this was a different kind of battlefield. It wasn't just Emily's words or Mom's jab, it was the way the room accepted it, as if my life, my sacrifices, could be summed up in a joke. I'd spent years building a career, earning respect from men like Admiral James Carter, my father's best friend, who'd once called me the daughter he never had. Dad used to say Carter saw the same fire in me that he did, but here in this ballroom, that fire was invisible. The laughter wasn't just about me, it was about every person who's ever been dismissed by the people who should know them best. I could have stood up, called them out, let my anger spill over. But I didn't. I waited. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is hold your ground, let the moment pass, and trust that truth has a way of finding its own voice. That's the lesson I carried that night. When people try to shrink, you don't give them the satisfaction of a fight. Let them think they've won, because the real victory comes when you show them who you are without saying a word. As the laughter died down and Emily raised her glass again, I noticed someone watching me from the head table. Not her husband, but a man with silver hair and a gaze that carried the weight of years. Admiral James Carter. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at me like he knew something the rest of the room didn't. What he did next would turn that ballroom upside down. Want to know how a single moment changed everything? Let's step into it together. The laughter in the ballroom was still echoing sharp and hollow as my sister Emily's words hung in the air. To Sarah, who guards the coat closet, she'd said, her smile gleaming under the chandeliers. My mother's follow-up, "She always made things harder," had drawn another wave of chuckles from the crowd. I sat at table 12, tucked by the fire exit, my dress blues feeling heavier than ever. I could have walked out, let their words fade into the Virginia night. But something held me there, a quiet instinct maybe, or the memory of my father's voice saying, "Stand tall, Sarah." Then, as the room settled, a chair scraped against the floor. All eyes turned to the head table, where a man with silver hair and a presence that commanded silence stood up. Admiral James Carter, my father's best friend, was about to rewrite the story they'd told about me. Carter's eyes found mine across the room, steady and unyielding, the way they must have been in Vietnam when he and Dad faced the impossible together. He raised a hand, not for a toast, but in a crisp military salute, the kind reserved for those who've earned it. The room froze. Major General Sarah Mitchell, he said, his voice like gravel over steel, saved my team in Afghanistan. She led us through a firefight when hope was a distant memory. She's not just a soldier, she's the pride of her father's legacy. The chandeliers seemed to dim the lilies on the tables less bright as every head turned toward me. Emily's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. My mother's face went pale, her hands gripping the tablecloth. The retired soldiers I'd noticed earlier stood now joining Carter's salute, their eyes shining with recognition. I stood returning the gesture, my heart pounding, but my stance unwavering. This wasn't just about me, it was about every moment I'd been dismissed, every letter unanswered, every sacrifice my family had swept aside. Carter knew my father better than anyone. He'd been there when Dad wrote me that letter, promising to watch over me. "Your dad saw you," Sarah Carter said later when we spoke. "He knew you'd carry his fire." In that ballroom, his words weren't just a defense, they were a reckoning. They forced the room to see me not as the sister who'd failed to fit, but as the woman who'd carried her father's courage into battles they'd never understand. Emily's knees buckled and she sank into her chair. My mother stared at Carter, then at me, as if seeing me for the first time. The laughter was gone, replaced by a silence that felt like truth. Here's what I learned in that moment. The right voice at the right time can shift the world beneath your feet. You don't always need to shout your worth. Sometimes it's enough to let someone else see it and speak it. Carter's salute wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who's been overlooked, waiting for their moment to be seen. I could have fought back against Emily's words myself, but his voice carried a weight that cut deeper than mine ever could. As the room buzzed with whispers and the band scrambled to start again, I felt something shift inside me. The truth was out, but it wasn't the end. There was another secret one that Emily had buried deeper than anyone knew, a secret that would change how I saw my family forever. Want to know what I found when I faced her? Let's walk into that moment together. The ballroom's chandeliers had dimmed, but the weight of Admiral Carter's words still hung in the air. My sister Emily's shattered glass lay scattered on the floor, a jagged reflection of her shock. My mother's face, pale and rigid, betrayed a crack in her carefully curated composure. I could have left that wedding and never looked back, carrying the victory of being seen. But something gnawed at me, a file I'd received from the Department of Defense just days before its contents, heavy in my coat pocket. It wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about facing a truth that cut deeper than their laughter. So 2 days later, I sat across from Emily in a quiet Virginia cafe, the smell of coffee grounding me as I prepared to unravel a secret she thought she'd buried. The file was thin, but damning, stamped with the Department of Defense seal. I slid it across the table, watching Emily's eyes flicker with unease. "Read it," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm inside. The document detailed an anonymous complaint filed 3 years ago accusing me of falsifying reports during a mission in Afghanistan, the same mission where I'd saved Admiral Carter's team. It nearly derailed my promotion to Major General, forcing me to face a grueling inquiry. I'd cleared my name, but the betrayal stung. The file traced the complaint to an email address Emily thought she'd hidden. Her hands trembled as she read, her face crumpling like tissue paper. "Why, Emily?" I asked. She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "You were always Dad's favorite, the soldier, the hero. I just wanted you to fail just once." Her words landed like a punch, but they weren't a surprise. I'd seen it in her eyes at Dad's funeral when she'd whispered that I'd shamed him. She was wrong, but her jealousy had almost cost me everything. This wasn't just about a letter or a lie, it was about a family that chose to tear one of us down to lift another up. Emily's resentment wasn't new. Dad used to tell stories of her clinging to him, wanting to be the one he bragged about. He'd loved us both, but he saw himself in me, the soldier who carried his fire. Admiral Carter had told me that once over coffee after a briefing, his eyes soft with memory. "Your dad knew you'd outshine them all," he'd said. Emily's complaint wasn't just an attack on me, it was her way of rewriting the story where she was never enough. Sitting in that cafe, I didn't yell or cry. I just looked at her, my sister, and saw someone who'd let envy turn her into a stranger. I could have hated her, but instead I felt a strange calm. The truth was out and it set me free in a way I hadn't expected. Here's what I learned in that cafe: facing the truth, no matter how painful, is the only way to reclaim your story. Hiding from it, ignoring it, only gives it power. Emily's confession didn't heal us, it showed me we were broken in ways I couldn't fix. But it gave me clarity. I wasn't the disgrace she'd painted me to be. I was the daughter my father believed in, the soldier Carter saluted. As I left the cafe, the file still on the table, I knew there was one more conversation I needed to have. My mother had her own secrets, ones tied to why she'd pushed me away for so long. What did she say when I faced her? Let's find out together. The Ohio house smelled of lemon cleaner and memory, just as it had when I was a girl. I stood in the living room, the same one where my father used to spin me around, his laughter filling the space between us. Now it was just me and my mother Helen sitting across from each other on faded floral couches. The silence between us was heavy, not like the quiet of a battlefield, but the kind that carries years of unsaid things. After Emily's confession in that Virginia cafe, I thought I'd heard it all: her jealousy, her anonymous letter that nearly cost me my career. But something told me Helen held a piece of this puzzle, a reason why she'd pushed me away for so long. As I looked at her, her hands twisting a napkin into knots, I braced myself for a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "Mom," I said, my voice softer than I expected, "why did you let me go?" Her eyes, sharp and guarded for so many years, softened just a fraction. She set the napkin down and pointed to a framed photo on the mantel, Dad in his uniform, standing beside Admiral James Carter, both young and grinning like the world was theirs. "Your father," she began, her voice trembling, "he saw you as his legacy, not Emily, you. He'd talk about you like you were born to carry his fire, to be the soldier he was." She paused, her fingers brushing the frame. "I thought if I let you fade, Emily could shine. I thought it would balance things." Her words weren't an apology, they were a confession. She'd chosen to erase me not because I'd failed, but because she believed my success dimmed her other daughter's light. I remembered a moment from my childhood, sitting on the porch with Dad while he polished his boots. He told me about Carter, how they'd survived ambushes in Vietnam, how Carter had promised to watch over me if anything happened to him. "You're my soldier," Dad had said, his eyes bright with pride. Helen saw that pride as a threat to Emily, the daughter she'd molded for a different life: garden parties, not battlefields. In her mind, my uniform, my medals, my connection to Dad's world made Emily invisible. So she pushed me out, ignored my calls, left my letters unopened. At Dad's funeral, when I stood in my dress blues, she'd handed me a program and walked away. Now, sitting in that living room, I saw the cost of her choice, not just for me, but for her. Her eyes were wet, but I didn't reach for her hand. "You didn't erase me, Mom," I said. "You made me stronger." Here's what I learned in that quiet house. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the hurt, it means choosing yourself despite it. I could have clung to anger, let it define me, but I chose to carry Dad's fire instead. Helen's confession didn't heal us, but it gave me clarity. I wasn't the daughter who'd failed. I was the one who'd lived up to her father's dream. Admiral Carter's salute at the wedding wasn't just about my service, it was a nod to that legacy, a promise kept. As I stood to leave, the photo of Dad and Carter caught the light, a reminder of who I was. But this wasn't the end of my story. I had one more step to take, not to fix my family, but to build something bigger than their rejection. Want to know what I did next? Let's see where this path leads. Leaving my mother's house in Ohio, I felt lighter, not because we'd reconciled, but because I'd reclaimed my truth. The confessions, Emily's betrayal, my mother's choice to erase me, had cracked open something inside me. Not anger, but purpose. I'd spent years carrying my father's fire, the same fire Admiral James Carter saw when he saluted me at that wedding. Dad's words, scribbled in his journal, echoed in my mind. "Sarah's like me, Jim. She'll fight for what's right." I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. There were others out there, soldiers like me, carrying scars, not just from battlefields, but from the people closest to them. That's when I knew I had to do something bigger. So I founded the Resilience Fund, a lifeline for military personnel betrayed by family or colleagues, a way to turn my pain into something that could heal others. I'll never forget the first person we helped, Mia, a young sergeant from Texas. I met her at a community center in Colorado where the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee filled the air. Mia sat across from me, her hands fidgeting with a dog tag she still wore even off duty. Her family had called her unstable after she reported harassment by a superior spreading lies that nearly ended her career. They said I was a disgrace, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. My own parents. I saw myself in her, the same hurt, the same fight to be seen. The Resilience Fund stepped in, providing legal support to clear her name and counseling to help her rebuild. Months later, Mia sent me a photo of herself in her new officer's uniform standing tall at her promotion ceremony. You gave me my life back, she wrote. That photo now sits on my desk, a reminder of why I started this. The Resilience Fund wasn't just about money or resources, it was about giving soldiers a voice when their own families silenced them. I thought of my father, how he'd stood by Admiral Carter in Vietnam, how they'd trusted each other when the world felt like it was falling apart. Carter had kept his promise to watch over me not just at the wedding, but in quiet moments like when he called to offer advice on the fund's mission. Your dad would be proud, he said, his voice thick with memory. Mia's story wasn't unique. Thousands of service members face betrayal not from enemies but from those they love. In the U.S., where military pride runs deep, we often celebrate the victories but ignore the personal costs. The fund became my way of honoring those costs, of saying, "You're not alone." Here's what I learned from starting the Resilience Fund. Your pain can become your power if you use it to lift others up. I could have let my family's rejection define me, but instead I built something that gave others a chance to rise. Mia's smile in that photo wasn't just her victory, it was mine too. The fund was my way of carrying Dad's legacy forward, of proving that strength isn't just surviving, it's helping others survive too. But this was only the beginning. I wanted to do more to reach beyond the military, to spark a bigger change. What happened when I took that next step? Let's find out how far this fire could spread. The Resilience Fund had become my anchor, a way to turn my family's rejection into something that lifted others up. Helping soldiers like Mia, whose families had turned their backs on them, showed me that my pain could light a path for others. But I wanted to do more than help one person at a time. I wanted to change the conversation, to make sure no soldier felt alone in their fight. So I started hosting community workshops, sharing my story to inspire others, not just in the military, but anyone who'd been silenced by those they loved. Standing in front of a crowd, I felt my father's fire burning brighter than ever, the same fire Admiral James Carter had seen when he saluted me at Emily's wedding. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about building a legacy that echoed beyond my own scars. One workshop held in a Denver community center stays with me. The room smelled of fresh paint and folding chairs creaked as people settled in, veterans' families, even a few teenagers with curious eyes. I stood at the podium, my dress blues swapped for a simple blazer, and told my story: the wedding, Emily's betrayal, my mother's confession, and how I'd found purpose in the Resilience Fund. Halfway through, a young man named Ethan stood up, his hands shaking but his voice steady. My dad said I was weak for leaving the army after PTSD, he said. Your story made me feel seen. The room went quiet, then erupted in applause. Ethan wasn't alone. Others shared their stories, their voices weaving a tapestry of pain and strength. I realized then that these workshops weren't just talks, they were a space for people to reclaim their worth, just as I had when Carter spoke my truth. This work was my way of honoring my father, who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with Carter in Vietnam, both of them believing in a world where courage mattered more than conformity. Carter had called me after that Denver workshop, his voice warm over the phone. Your dad always said you'd lead Sarah, he told me. Not just soldiers, but hearts. In America, we celebrate military heroes, but we rarely talk about the personal battles they face: betrayal from family, judgment from those who don't understand. My workshops called for change, advocating for policies to protect service members from personal attacks like the ones Mia and Ethan faced. Each story shared, each hand raised, felt like a step toward a world where no one had to fight alone. I wasn't just speaking, I was carrying Dad's legacy forward, making sure his fire burned in others. Here's what I learned from those workshops. Your story, no matter how broken it feels, can spark change if you share it. Hiding your pain keeps you small, but speaking it gives others permission to rise. Ethan's courage to stand up that day wasn't just his victory, it was a reminder that my voice could light the way for others. I could have stayed silent, let my family's rejection define me, but instead I chose to build a community where no one felt invisible. As I left Denver, a notebook full of names and stories in my bag, I knew my work wasn't done. There was a new chapter waiting, one where I'd find peace not just for others, but for myself. Want to know where that chapter took me? Let's walk through it together. After the workshops, the stories, and the lives we'd touched through the Resilience Fund, I felt a quiet pull to step back to find a place where I could breathe. My father's fire had carried me through battles, betrayals, and the weight of my family's rejection. But even fire needs a moment to flicker softly. So I left the bustle of bases and city lights for a small cottage in Maine where the ocean whispers secrets to the rocky shore. The air there smelled of salt and pine, and for the first time in years, I felt the space to be just Sarah, not the Major General, not the disgraced daughter, just me. But even in that quiet, I carried my father's legacy, and the promise Admiral James Carter had kept finding peace while still connected to those I'd helped like Mia, whose strength reminded me why I'd fought so hard. Mornings in Maine began with coffee on the porch watching waves crash against the cliffs. I'd set up an easel by the window painting seascapes in blues and grays, each stroke a way to process the years I'd carried in silence. In the afternoons, I wrote a book about my journey from the Ohio house where my mother tried to dim my light to the ballroom where Carter's salute lit it up again. One day, as I sifted through emails, I found a message from Mia, the sergeant we'd helped through the fund. Attached was a photo of her in her officer's uniform standing at her promotion ceremony, her smile wide and proud. "Because of you, I'm here," she wrote. I pinned that photo above my desk next to a letter from my father I'd found in his journal, the one where he'd asked Carter to watch over me. "You're my soldier," Dad had written, and in Maine, I finally felt like I'd honored that. This new life wasn't about running away, it was about building a home for the woman I'd become. Maine's quiet let me reflect on what Carter had said after a workshop. "Your dad knew you'd lead Sarah not just in war, but in life." I thought of him and Dad in Vietnam, their bond forged in trust, and how Carter's voice at the wedding had given me back my father's pride. In America, we often chase peace as if it's a destination, a place to arrive after the fight. But I learned it's something you create moment by moment. I stayed connected to the fund, answering emails from soldiers, guiding them through their own battles with family or betrayal. Each message was a thread weaving me into a community stronger than the one I'd lost. Painting, writing, and helping others became my way of living my father's legacy, not just as a soldier, but as someone who chose to rise above pain. Here's what I learned in that cottage by the sea: peace isn't found by erasing your past, it's built by embracing who you are, scars and all. I could have let my family's rejection keep me from this quiet joy, but instead I chose to create a life that honored my truth. Mia's photo, my father's letter, Carter's words. They reminded me that peace is a choice, not a gift. As I watched the Maine sunset paint the sky in hues I'd never capture on canvas, I knew my journey wasn't over. There was one final step, not to mend what was broken with my family, but to share a message with the world. Want to know what I said to those who felt unseen? Let's close this chapter together. The Maine sunset painted the sky in colors I'd never quite capture on canvas, but it reminded me of something my father used to say. "Sarah, your light shines brightest when you share it." Sitting in my cottage with Mia's photo on my desk and his letter tucked beside it, I realized my journey wasn't just about surviving my family's rejection. It was about turning their silence into a voice for others. From the wedding where Admiral James Carter saluted me to the workshops where people like Ethan found courage, I'd learned that family can hurt you, but you have the power to write your own story. My father's fire, the one Carter saw in me, wasn't just for battlefields, it was for lighting up the dark corners where others felt unseen. One evening, as I scrolled through comments on a video from one of my workshops, I found a message that stopped me cold. A woman named Lisa wrote, "Your story gave me the strength to tell my brother I'm not the failure he thinks I am." Her words hit me like a warm wave, reminding me of why I'd shared my story in the first place. In America, we're taught to keep our pain private, to smile through the hurt. But Lisa's comment, like Ethan's voice in Denver, showed me that sharing your truth can ripple outward, touching lives you'll never meet. My father and Carter had taught me that, in their own way, through stories of Vietnam, through promises kept across decades. By speaking out, I wasn't just honoring Dad's legacy, I was building a new one story at a time. Here's what I learned: your story, no matter how heavy it feels, has the power to lift someone else. Don't hide it because someone out there needs to hear it. I could have let my mother's silence or Emily's betrayal keep me small, but I chose to stand tall to create the resilience fund to share my truth. Now I'm asking you to do the same. Have you ever felt unseen by the people who should know you best? Have you been hurt by family but found strength to rise? I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. Let's build a community where no one feels alone. If my journey made you feel seen, hit that like button. If you want more stories like this, comment more, and let's keep this fire burning together.